The Supreme Court chamber fell into a silent hush as Justice Amy Coney Barrett addressed Elon Musk directly. Her voice was one of evident skepticism. The oral arguments in Federal Communications Commission v. SpaceX had taken a surprising personal turn as the Supreme Court justice asked if the billionaire understood the needs of rural America. "Mr. Musk," Justice Barrett said, glancing down at her notes, "you've consistently argued that your satellite internet service is largely a benefit to rural areas, and yet your background suggests minimal personal experience with the problems of rural America. How does someone who spent their life in urban tech hubs truly appreciate the telecommunications requirements of farmers in Iowa or ranchers in Montana?" The blunt question, challenging both Musk's credibility and the fundamental assumption of his case, caused some of the other justices to look up with interest. The Supreme Court case before us was SpaceX's challenge to FCC regulations that would significantly stifle its Starlink satellite internet service, an issue with potentially life-altering consequences for millions of Americans in rural communities with limited option for connectivity. Musk froze for a moment at the podium, his expression unreadable. Rather than delivering the corporate defense most expected, he set aside his prepared statements. What followed was a deeply personal response that shifted the mood of the Supreme Court of the country, with Justice Barrett visibly emotional, wiping away tears with a tissue. Musk revealed a side to his personality the world had not witnessed before. Before diving into this remarkable Supreme Court showdown that has the potential to redefine America's strategy on rural connectivity, take a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel for additional detailed examinations of landmark moments in tech, law, and policy. Justice Amy Coney Barrett had made a name for herself as one of the Supreme Court's most meticulous questioners since her controversial confirmation in 2020. With a reputation for a sharp legal mind and attention to detail, Barrett tended to question assumptions underlying arguments that appeared before the court. With her background as a federal appeals judge and professor of law, she had earned a reputation for being one who closely examined the factual foundations of legal arguments, particularly in cases involving technical questions. The case, Federal Communications Commission v. SpaceX, was a fork in the road for rural telecommunications in the United States. The question before the FCC was whether it had the authority to impose new regulatory conditions that would, in effect, force SpaceX to shut down 40% of its Starlink satellites, cutting coverage in America's most rural areas by a staggering percentage. The FCC argued the regulations were necessary to reduce orbital congestion, while SpaceX argued they were arbitrary, capricious, and would disproportionately harm rural Americans. To Elon Musk, the stakes went well beyond corporate bottom lines. Starlink was his most socially impactful venture yet, bringing high-speed internet to the regions where terrestrial infrastructure was still economically impossible. Prior to the Supreme Court hearing, Musk had reiterated this mission time and time again. This isn't about market share or quarterly results. This is about whether millions of Americans will continue having access to the digital economy, educational resources, and telemedicine that many of us take for granted. The case had generated unusual public interest. Rural advocacy groups filed amicus briefs on behalf of SpaceX, while incumbent telecommunications providers backed the FCC. Rural state Congress members wrote open letters to the court requesting that it consider the human face of its decision. Medical societies documented how Starlink had enabled remote health care in previously underserved communities. Justice Barrett's question expressed a fundamental skepticism which several justices and FCC commissioners harbored. Could a billionaire technologist ever understand and prioritize rural needs? This skepticism had been stoked by press accounts portraying Musk as detached from everyday American life, his focus on grandiose projects like the colonization of Mars. Neither Justice Barrett nor the public knew that Musk's commitment to rural connectivity stemmed from experiences never made public, experiences that had shaped his understanding of digital isolation many years earlier, before he was a household name. Just as Musk was ready to reply to Barrett's challenge, he impulsively decided to abandon his lawyer's talking points and address the justice's inquiry from a place of personal truth. The shift in tone would change the direction of the proceedings. Justice Barrett. Musk began, his voice less loud but still firm. I appreciate you asking me to share my understanding of rural America's issues. He paused, clearly considering his next words with great care. The courtroom was silent. The normal shuffling of papers and hushed discussions between attorneys temporarily halted. Contrary to public opinion, I was not always the man who stands before you today, Musk continued. Before I began my businesses, before I moved to California, I had formative years in very different circumstances. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward slightly, her curiosity aroused. Chief Justice Roberts, who generally had a poker face during arguments, was also paying close attention to this detour. When I first came to North America as a teenager, I worked on my cousin's farm in Saskatchewan, Canada, Musk continued. Not as the owner's son, not as a visitor, but as labor. I spent months in a province where towns were occasionally 50 miles distant from each other, where internet wasn't slow. It didn't exist for most residents. Justice Barrett's expression softened slightly, her initial wariness giving way to careful consideration. Later, while in college in Pennsylvania, Musk spent summers working in the rural areas of the state, including a sawmill in one town, so remote that workers drove 2 hours to get to the most basic services most Americans take for granted in a matter of minutes. Musk reached out for a drink of water, the first bit of emotion creeping into his typically impassive face. Continuing, his voice took on a quality rarely detected in his public speeches, a rawness that seemed to suggest genuine vulnerability. What is not to be found in my official biography, Justice Barrett, responded Musk, is that when I sold my very first software company, I didn't immediately create Tesla or SpaceX. I waited 6 months and resided in a rural community in Colorado, linked by a dial-up which always dropped, seeing for myself the isolation that occurs when digital connection is unstable or non-existent. The justices exchanged a glance, clearly not expecting this introspective statement. Musk's own legal team appeared equally surprised, suggesting this was not part of their prepared strategy. But my understanding of rural connectivity challenges isn't merely autobiographical, Musk continued. Composing himself, he reached into his suit jacket and removed several folded papers. With the court's permission, I'd like to share something not included in our briefs. The Chief Justice nodded, making an exception to standard protocol. These are letters, just a small selection from thousands we've received from rural Americans whose lives have been transformed by access to reliable internet. Musk unfolded the first page. This is from Sarah Johansson, a third-generation farmer in North Dakota, who wrote, "Before Starlink, my children couldn't participate in remote learning during winter storms. Now my daughter is taking advanced courses not offered in our small school district." He read from another letter, from Dr. James Wilson in rural Kentucky. "I can now provide telemedicine consultations to patients who previously had to drive 3 hours one way to see a specialist. For older patients, this isn't convenience. It's the difference between receiving care or not receiving care." As Musk continued reading excerpts, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. These weren't corporate sound bites or dry legal points. They were actual human moments demonstrating the effect of the case in the world. Justice Barrett, who had begun the conversation with skepticism, was now engaged, her initial skepticism replaced by serious consideration. As Musk read the final letter, one from a rural Wyoming veteran explaining how connectivity enabled him to gain mental health services while physically cut off, Barrett's face became more and more emotional. And then there was the moment that would be boiled down into nationwide headlines. Musk spoke directly to Justice Barrett and departed from legal tradition entirely. "Justice Barrett, you asked whether I actually do know the telecommunications needs of rural America. The truth is that no one person does. But what I do know, by way of personal experience and from the thousands of stories shared with our team, is the profound human cost of being cut off digitally. And respectfully, that is something the FCC's technical arguments about orbital parameters completely fail to address." Justice Barrett's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion when Musk concluded his responses. The normally composed Justice reached for a tissue and carefully wiped the corner of one eye. A remarkably human moment never observed in the revered chambers of the Supreme Court. The room remained still, the impact of Musk's words hanging in the air. Barrett resumed, speaking in a noticeably softer voice after recovering from the moment. "Thank you, Mr. Musk, for that perspective. It puts the human aspect of this case into perspective in a manner our briefs perhaps did not quite achieve." Chief Justice Roberts, recognizing the abrupt shift of pace of proceedings, interrupted with uncharacteristic candor. "Mr. Musk, the court appreciates your personal testimony. Given what you've shared, I'd like to ask a more specific question about the FCC's technical justifications for these regulations." This opening allowed Musk to pivot back to the legal substance of the case, but with the emotional foundation now firmly established. He proceeded to methodically dismantle the FCC's arguments, detailing how the new regulations would hit the farthest users hardest while doing very little to address the stated concerns over orbital crowding. The FCC lawyer attempted to regain control of the discussion, but Justice Barrett herself countered the argument. "Counsel, is it the FCC's argument that these human effects are merely anecdotes and not substantive factors within the Communications Act's public interest standard?" The FCC attorney clearly grappled with this unexpected obstacle. Justice Thomas, previously silent, spoke as follows. "The issue isn't whether or not balancing is necessary, but whether the FCC in fact did that balancing in a way that is consistent with the requirements of its statutes. Mr. Musk has introduced strong evidence indicating they did not." As arguments concluded, the shift in the court's engagement was palpable. What began as a parched technical regulatory dispute had become a rich investigation of digital fairness and rural America's place in the modern economy. Legal pundits recognized that they had witnessed something historic, not just for this case, but for the manner in which the court might approach regulating technology in the future.